Welcome to Audio Gyan with Kedar Nimkar, a podcast that documents insightful conversations with Indian designers, artists, musicians, writers, thinkers, and creatives of all types. Here's your host, Kedar Nimkar.
Daniel Kahneman, in his book Thinking Fast and Slow, mentions that people are innately irrational when it comes to making decisions. Same goes with how they consume everyday product. In the book Design of Everyday Things, Don Norman speaks about how people blame themselves if they are not able to pull the drawer, rather than blaming the designer. Well, there definitely seems to be a pattern, and let's explore a few of them, and more importantly, a designer's role in this entire scheme of things. Being a digital product designer myself, I have few insights. But to know more, today I have Navneet Nair with us on AudioGan. Navneet is head of design at PhonePe. For over last 2 decades, he has been an hands-on practitioner of design and user-focused creative arts. Navneet has worked in both individual contributor roles and leadership positions at startups and established companies like Yahoo and Google. So yeah, thank you, Navneet, for giving your time. It's a real pleasure to have you on AudioGan. Yeah, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Kedar.
So the entire conversation or the premise of this discussion is about value-centered design, which you have uh, quite extensively written about, spoken at multiple places. So I wanted to just capture that and slightly deep dive into your understanding. And being a designer, like have sort of a heart-to-heart conversation with respect to where what role is design playing in this startup ecosystem when it comes to digital products.
Absolutely. Would love to talk about that.
Superb. So like I've come up with few questions, and I'll start off by asking, like, what's your reading? How big or small role does design play in the landscape of the startup world which India is facing?
Yeah, interesting question. So before that, I would like to ask you a question myself.
Sure.
We should ask ourselves when we talk about startups, are we playing football or are we playing basketball?
If you, are you considering like pan world concept, or are you considering
No,
US?
actually, I'm just asking this in the concept of there are two types of games. So there is a game of football,
Mm-hmm.
which is primarily a weak link game,
Okay.
and there is basketball on the other hand, and there is a fundamental difference between the two. Now, let's say you are a football team and you want to improve a football team. What would you do? Would you improve your best player or would you improve the worst player?
Improve the best player.
Actually, no. In football, what you need to do is you need to improve the worst player. So what
Okay.
happens in football is that, to hit a goal, you need to take about what, 7, 8 passes, and you might have like 7 good passes, but the eighth one might just not work out, and you might not be able to hit a goal. And that eighth pass has gone to the worst player in the team. So what happens is that they have done run simulations, and what they found is that, let's say you improve your best player by 5%. So they have a percentile ranking. You, by a 5 percentile point, you improve your best player. You might at the most get a 3% lift. But if you do the same thing for your worst ranked player, say your worst ranked player is 35th percentile, and you get them to something like a 40th percentile or a 41st percentile, you will see a 30% lift in your efficiency, in your goals that are scored, in the points that are scored. So football is a weak link game. Your team is only as strong as its weakest link. On the other
Interesting.
hand, basketball is the complete opposite. So in basketball, you could have one Magic Jordan or one LeBron, and that player can carry the entire game for you. So when you
Hmm.
want to improve your basketball team, you improve the strongest player.
Hmm. It's
So in
quite.
that in that
Hmm.
context, actually, startups are weak link games. So the reason I say that is that supposing you have a great technology team and you have a great sales team, but you don't have a great design team, you don't have a great marketing team, your startup is very likely not to succeed. The same thing, even if you have a great design team, but you don't have a great technology team or you don't have a great marketing team, again it's the same result. So when you want to do the improve a startup, think of it like a weak link game. You need to improve the weakest function in your startup and start improving it. Now, if design is the weakest function in your startup, you definitely need to improve it. But if you have a strong design team, adding more strong designers to it will not help you much. So when we look at design and how important design is in the startup world, we need to think a little differently. It really depends on what state your startup or your company is. So just by having a great team of designers working on something that is really out of the world, but not having somebody to implement it is, I mean, fairly logical. It doesn't work. But let's say you find somebody to implement it, but it's not such a great product that you have built, the product will not do well in the market. So when you look at startups, you have to think holistically. You cannot think in silos. You can't think like, oh, designers are really important, I need to have designers over there. But today what happens is that in most startups, there is the whole startup ecosystem, instead of going after building products that will last for a long time, what they're running after is getting funding. Funding is the end game of the entire game that we are playing out here. So basically, it is a funding game. So what happens is that you are basically trying to fill up a checkbox that says, I have this designer in my team, and that's about it. But what we need to ask is, within design itself, what is good design? I mean, is it good visual design? Or is it something else? Is it good interaction design, or is it good
Overall experience
creative?
part of it. Yeah.
Yes. So good design is a combination of both aesthetics and experience. So inside design itself, we have the whole concept of weak link, strong link. You cannot have something that is more pivoted towards visual design and say, I don't care so much about the experience. I do not care so much about the interactions. I do not care about usability as long as I have a sexy looking app. Or the other way around, saying that, oh no, I have to made sure that it is the most easy to use app, but it looks like crap. It doesn't work. You need to have that holistic view. So in all, when we look at it, the role of design has to be viewed from the point of view of where you are as a startup and what is it that you need to augment as a startup and how you need to fill in those gaps. And this changes in the way that your startup also progresses. So at one point of time, you may find that, okay, there is a certain kind of level that importance that design may bring, and maybe the best designer to get in at that point might be somebody who is heavy on user research or interaction design. But then as you move up, you may find that, oh, I need to improve the amount of delight that I want to get in. Then you want to add visual design as a thing. So we need to be very pragmatic about how we look at design and at what stage we need to bring in designers and what type of designers to bring in.
Very beautifully put. I mean, yeah, there's a different perspective. I mean, it's somewhere after 12-15 years of experience, you gain those insights, but the way you have articulated or just put in context just gives a very simple approach to it. Are there any, I would say, any benchmark or any thumb rules to follow in this case? If because you have been hiring for quite some time now, so
Yeah.
Are there any insights there?
So in terms of thumb rules, I think very specifically, the one thumb rule that you want to follow is always hire the best talent that is available within the type of talent that you can get in. So if you have got
but isn't it a vicious cycle? Sorry to interrupt, but this I've experienced in multiple places that initially your product is not appealing to the designer market in the country, like for people from NID and different design schools. They have some aspiration ki main, like I will go to Netflix or I'll go to whatever Swiggy and other places. Now the product itself is good, but when it comes to a startup, you really don't have that exposure or that reach to excite an upcoming designer. So it
yes,
becomes like
I
a
think
cycle.
Which is where design leaders come in. So a design leader is somebody who is probably able to attract the right kind of talent for you. Now, if you are able to convince a design leader to agree into your vision, and the leader at whatever level is able to come in and make a difference, now that, like you're saying, it's a vicious circle. The moment you start seeing effects around it, you start attracting more and more talent along with it. So the question is to say, okay, who is that? So the leader sort of plays the role of a social media influencer. They come in and say that, yes, this is a company, this is a startup that I vouch for. And once that is done, there is a certain image that gets changed for that particular startup, and you are able to then attract more talent. You are absolutely right that, getting the talent is definitely a problem. But at the same time, when I'm saying talent that I'm looking for, it need not be somebody who is like this designer who has got 5 years of experience working with some of the best people, and that is the most talented designer. What you're looking for is raw talent a lot of time, and it really depends on how you can get them into the system and how you can get them to perform. Here again, it's very important to have somebody who can recognize raw talent and get them to perform within the team. So it is definitely very important when you are starting off hiring the correct leader who can then bring in the right amount of talent is definitely important. When you're starting off, you might find, okay, really there is nobody that I can hire as a design leader, because that is also a role that is not easy to fill in. You may at that point bring in an absolutely talented designer on board and getting a so like I said, it is all about getting the talent density. Now this is something that is if Netflix talks a lot about, they talk about talent density. And talent density doesn't mean that you need to have like uh, 10 great, 15 great, 25 great designers. Even if you have five great designers, those five are really good designers. So it means about managing that density of really good people around you. It's not an easy thing to do,
Correct.
but I think if you can achieve it, that's a great thing to achieve.
Yeah, yeah. In fact, I would like to borrow one phrase which Kunal Shah mentioned in one of the podcasts, that don't be like a logo collector in the initial years of your life. Like look for the right designer and get mentored, get guidance under that particular designer rather than just collecting logos. So I think
Absolutely.
what you're saying is also on the similar lines, that you first try and work with the right set of people, probably like a good design leader, get some understanding, and then probably switch jobs.
Yeah, so it is absolutely important for younger designers who are moving up. Exactly what Kunal said,
Hmm.
in sense of it is absolutely important who you work with than where you work, because who you work with will determine the entire trajectory of your career, rather than the where you work, which is probably going to be there on your resume, might get you a step into a particular interview, but it's not going to determine how you will perform at that particular workplace, because that is what matters most. Whereas
So
working with the right people will help you in your entire career trajectory by making the right by you it'll change your thinking itself, so you will be thinking in a different kind of a way.
so true, so true. So I'll shift gears a bit, and we like I initially spoke about the irrational user. You have spoken a bit about it. You have also written articles. So can you tell us what the thought behind this irrational user, and then how does design as a concept um, enable you to cater to this user?
Yeah, so I think this is something that is being talked about a lot in the past few years. Daniel Kahneman has talked about it, Dan Ariely has talked about it, Richard Thaler talks about it, and this whole field of behavioral economics is
Hmm.
something that is coming up and making a lot of difference in the way people approach designing not just designing but building products itself. So the whole idea being that human beings don't necessarily think rationally. When we used to think about economics used to have this concept saying that a man makes a rational decision, and based on that they will choose to make sure that they have the highest profits and avoid losses as much as possible.
Yeah.
Now
That was with more like the group herd mentality, and that was the assumption. When they moved down to individual levels, it was quite a different
it
discovery.
was absolutely different. So what happens is that you would think that yes, on a global pattern basis you might see certain patterns playing out, but individually people just performed absolutely differently. And behavioral economics actually uh, latches onto some of the individual irrationality, so to speak, and then uses to that can be used to amplify the actual results that come out of it. That is one part of it. The other part of it is that people on a general sense can think rationally within the amount of uh, parameters that they are privy to. For example, I know A, B, C, D, and I can make a rational decision only on the basis of A, B, C, D that I know. But there is E, F, G, H, which I don't know, and I have no way of incorporating that into my model. Most people, when they think about making a rational decision, they are making a rational decision only on the basis of things that they understand. This is called bounded rationality. Now, when we look at designing, most designers also have a sort of a bounded rationality that they work within. They say, okay, I think the user will do A, B, C, D, and based on that, I will make my design. Usually, in design talk, what we talk about is this is a happy flow of a user, saying that the user will do A, B, C, D, and I assume that most people are going to do that, and I designed the system to work for the happy flow, and I'm fine with it. I think I have completed my work. But when you put this out into the real world, it completely breaks because people don't have happy flows because human beings are innately complex beings. We have a lot of things going on, not just in our mind, but also just in the way our emotions work, the way our motivations work, all of it work. So, as designers, we need to step back and appreciate this complexity. And most of all, we need to appreciate that human beings are not rational, but they're fundamentally irrational. So there are a lot of these biases that today we speak of. I mean, there is cognitive biases. There are a bunch of stuff that Richard Thaler puts in some of his books, and there is this book Art of Clear Thinking, which is also a great book that very quickly puts in all of these art of thinking clearly. I think that is the name of the book. It puts all of this into a very nice format where you can just go refer it, and you have all of the cognitive biases arranged fairly well. I think as designers, we need to start appreciating this a lot more and start, instead of thinking of users as a persona. So the whole idea of building a persona that most people just sit down and write, oh, this is my user persona, and I feel that this is how my user will behave, and they expect that every 100,000 of their users, or even like 1 million of the users, are going to behave exactly the same way. It just does not work like that. So as designers, we should start appreciating the whole area of behavioral economics a lot more, and start incorporating some lessons from there into our designs as well.
But then how does the 80-20 rule kick in? Because that will conflict this behavior, right? I mean, this approach.
The 80-20 rule is basically saying that you have 20% of the users who kind of do a
Random
whole lot
things,
of
yeah. Yeah.
correct. But at the same time, what happens is that it doesn't mean that out of 100, 20 people are irrational or 20 people are rational. In fact, this level of irrationality is present in all of us. We all have that irrationality within us. So even if you take that, to assume that only 20% of our users are going to be irrational, or the other way around, that only 20% are going to be rational, is also not true. the level of irrationality is present in all of us. It is an innate human tendency to react to certain things in certain kinds of ways. It could be, for example, just what is going on in the world today, where the media is making the best use of all the uh, things that we are seeing around us. We believe in a certain kind of politics, and when we see things going the other way around, we reify our own belief. We say no, what we think is right, and that is called cognitive dissonance. Now, cognitive dissonance is not only that the right wing is cognitive dissonance and or left wing is cognitive dissonance. I think cognitive dissonance is present in both of these cases. So you cannot say that it is only one type of users who are affected by irrationality. Pretty much entire user base is affected by irrationality. So we can't do without thinking about that in our design.
I think I have like a nice small plug, which is going to be a nice segue to the next question. And I like let's see if I can connect the dots here. While I was working in ClearTrip, it had a different philosophy altogether. Although the market share today is like, yeah, people know about it, but uh, if you look at the type of work which we used to do there, it was this pushing the envelope for this top 5 top 10% of the users, making the experience better and better and frictionless as much as possible. And it's sort of implicit that we are like working for that happy use case further and making it much more frictionless, which is sort of Apple's route as well, right? They're not going wide but going deep. How would you connect these two three dots to like a value centered design? Because it's also end of the day we have to make business, we have to have growth.
Correct.
So do you see any pattern there? You know what I mean, right?
So I understand that there are certain there is a certain way that you can play in the business by making sure that you are kind of addressing la cream de la cream kind of an audience, and addressing issues for them, be it, let's say, people who are the 1% of India who is able to afford, or I don't know, maybe even lesser, who are able to afford flying by flight, and making things easier for them, or the very small percentage of people who are able to afford a MacBook or an iPhone, and making it really really great for them. Now there is a market.
No, when I say this, I also put a disclaimer that over a period of time I've realized like these are outliers. These are not like the mainstream. So
Absolutely.
yeah. So continue. Yeah.
So yes, these are outliers, and the thing that actually confuses us as designers is that we think that just because the media is glorifying a lot of these, this is exactly what works. Whereas if you look at it, the amount of people who have a Geo phone is going to be like much larger than the number of people who are ever going to have an iPhone, because just by the sheer number of people that are going to be there. I mean, once the whole of India has got phones, the number of the cheaper phones are just going to be so huge that it's just not going to be there. But the margins that you make on the higher phone is much higher. So yes, you can definitely make a good business case over there. But when you're doing that, it is not just the product that you're selling, because if you look at it today, let's say the Chinese players like maybe a OnePlus or some of them have really come up with flagship phones that are maybe as good or better than some of the flagship iPhones that are out there. But what is it that a company like an Apple is able to differentiate over, let's say, a OnePlus? And this, I think, comes very fairly and squarely thanks to what Steve Jobs' philosophy was. He basically did not. He said that people don't buy a product. People basically buy the why behind that product. They basically are buying the value of what you're selling. So for example, he said, they don't just make computers. So they're saying, what is it that you make? Yeah, we make computers. But it is not just that computers that they are selling. They're not selling computers. They're selling the thing that, oh, we are making products for the people who think different. We are selling the value of, you, if you are buying an Apple computer, you are somebody who thinks different. So this way, what you are actually selling to people is a value that you stand for. And that is where I sort of come up with this whole concept of a value centered design. Now, usually when we look at design, we think about one. I mean, why did design get uh, there as a function, as a profession? Is basically to get profits into the system. Basically, you get into a business so that you can make money, and to enable you to make money, you need to design a product, and that is where design would come in. So the whole function of design was to make sure that it made money for the person who owned that particular business. And this has been more or less the way that design has always come into play. There is a very interesting story that I tell people about uh, uh, a car that Ford had created. So basically, in 1978, they had this. Japanese cars were coming into the US, and these Japanese car manufacturers like Toyota and Honda, they had very inexpensive cars out there. So Lee Iacocca, who was leading Ford at that time, he commissioned a car. He said, it should cost not more than $2,000. So that's the general guidelines that he put around it. He said it should cost no more than $2,000. It should be built in 25 months because we have to get it done fairly quickly. And with this basic guidelines, the Ford engineers actually built a car, and the car was actually fairly good looking, because even Steve Jobs at one point used to drive this car. It's called the Ford Pinto. So the car actually did fairly well, but there was one problem with it. Whenever there was a rear end collision, the car would catch fire, and because of this, about 200 people lost their lives in accidents over about 5 to 10 years period. About 200 people lost their lives in the Ford Pinto. And over a period of time, the Ford Pinto was called one of the worst cars ever made by Ford. And this is not just old times and cars that we are talking about. Today, even if you look at Boeing, they have this 737 Max aircraft that was there. The 737 Max aircraft was basically supposed to be in competition to the Airbus A320 Neo. But when they did that particular aircraft, what they figured out was the center of gravity was not correct. So it used to tilt in a certain angle. And they decided to introduce a software to adjust for the tilt. But they did not tell the pilots that there is a software that is running behind, and because of which the pilots really did not go. At one point of time, they really did not know what was happening, because the plane started adjusting its lift when the pilots were doing it the opposite way. And this caused it's caused so many crashes, because of which the whole Boeing aircrafts had to be grounded. So these are cases where you look at profit and look at design and then build everything around it. So this doesn't work. So if you just keep profit in mind and do the stuff, you cannot build good designs. At the same time, so we said, okay, we have to think about users, come user-centered design. But you look at user-centered design, what happens is, if you take, let's say, Facebook, for example, or one of these social media sites, for example, you make it so easy to use that suddenly people are addicted to it. Is it the right thing? I mean, now we have the entire social dilemma on Netflix, which talks about the whole problem with social networking and all. And it's basically saying that I have made the site so easy to use and so addictive that people start coming back to it. So again, when we're thinking about it, you're looking at users and you're looking at profits. That also really doesn't work. So which is why the third part of it needs to come in, which is the value. You need to start by asking the question, why are you building this particular product? So at PhonePe, for example, we do have something like a value statement that we stand for. For us, our product value statement is to offer every Indian equal opportunity to accelerate their progress by liberating the flow of money. Now, it's a bit of a mouthful, but it basically says that we are very inclusive when it comes to growth. We don't look at that 5% of people who really have an iPhone or who really take flights and travel to far off countries for holidays. We actually think about the entire India, and we want to give them equal opportunity to accelerate the progress. And the way that we do it is by liberating the flow of money, because that is the entire premise on which PhonePe as a company has been built, of making sure that transactions happen as easy as possible. So what that has happened, for example, what we did was, we looked at multiple cases. At one point we said, India is a cash economy, and we pretty much are pushing towards the digital economy. But in India, even though it is a cash economy with about 1.3 billion people, there are actually only 2.5 lakhs ATMs in all of India.
Oh, okay. Mm-hmm.
And most of these ATMs are in the urban areas. So if you go to a rural area, there are hardly any ATMs out there. And in fact, I was in Karnataka, one of the villages at one point in time, in Mungod. And what I discovered over there, that there was this bank, and that Saraswat Bank had an ATM. I thought, I needed some money, and it was a Sunday. And I decided to go. The ATM was inside the bank. Because what happens is that when you have an ATM outside the bank, you need to have a guard to protect it. But because it was a village, they did not have resources to put a guard on that. So what they did was they put the ATM inside the bank building. And Sunday being a bank holiday, the bank was closed. So on Sundays, you can't use the ATM. The point of an ATM is like an anytime money, right? I mean, Sunday ko nahi milta hai. So that was
2.5 lakhs seems to be very less. Yeah.
Yes, that is all that there is actually. So what happens is that most people go to banks, stand in lines, withdraw money, and come out. So that is how most of India withdraws their money. So what we did at PhonePe was, we said, we have all of these merchants around us who use PhonePe. So we said we will enable every merchant to become an ATM and help people withdraw cash for themselves. So you could scan a PhonePe QR, get money from the merchant, and we basically enabled that entire thing where a merchant could say that this is a cash withdrawal and give that money. And today, I mean, if a merchant wanted to charge like a 1 rupee for a 10 rupee withdrawal, you could do it. I mean, or you could say charge 2 rupees for a 100 rupee withdrawal, whatever the rate that the merchant wanted to charge. So it is a win-win for both of them. The people are able to get cash out. The merchants are able to use this as a service that they are providing. So that way we are able to liberate the flow of money, and we are doing this en masse for the whole of India. So that is what the PhonePe ATM story was there. And within a short period of time, we had about 10 lakhs merchants signed up. So within that short period, we became like India's largest ATM network. Unfortunately, COVID happened, and the whole thing now is not going in the same direction that we planned to. But this is an example of how we started off with a value and then said, okay, let's solve for a need that India has, and then solve for that. So even at a mass level, you can still start with a value and then solve for it. Whereas Apple has been doing it for the high end, and they have been doing it very well in terms of starting with a value of people who think different, and I'm offering you tools for people who think different. Definitely, Apple does a great job at that. But even when you do look at a mass market, you could still do something similar.
Mm-hmm. But is there, so the way you mentioned that user-centered design also has this addictiveness, or the other one which you mentioned about, is there any catch in value-centered design?
See, there is definitely a catch when it comes to what is the value that you stand for. You could definitely stand for a value which is not positive. And that definitely is a huge catch. And I don't know how to solve for that without saying that, okay, you need to have a conscience that you as a designer would uh, want to develop, which I think over a period of time, everybody develops. I mean, when I was at Google, I used to design used to be the designer on Orkut. When I was doing social media design at that point of time, I probably did not think about all of these issues as being, building for addiction. I just said, oh, I want users to come back, so I'm going to go put this feature in. I've seen other people do it and it works very well. I have used it, it seems to work very well. So I that conscience doesn't build till today. Now when I think about it and I say, okay, I know that I can put in this feature that is going to cause people to get variable rewards, and people are going to come in because they'll feel that, oh, this variable reward is going to come. But at the back of my mind, I know that I should not be doing it. I should be doing it responsibly. I should start thinking about that. So that whole thing about responsible design is something that comes to you after having been in the system for some time, and saying that, it's profit is not everything. You need to start thinking about ethics and moral values also, and make sure that that is also incorporated in design.
Very nice, very nice. I mean, I read this book, Ruined by Design, and frankly, it is once you read, you understand where you are heading, what are you doing. It is good for introspection overall. You spoke about responsible design. You spoke about the weak link angle. So, if you have to teach, or if you have to give some tip, or if you have to give some suggestion, because these words have a different connotation, but generally, थोड़ा सा ज्ञान देना है अगर for the upcoming designers as well, after 12, 15 years, after mastering, or after hoping to master some sort of a craft and design, I have realized that economics is something very important which every designer should understand. So if I have to put you with the same question, that if a full stack designer is supposed to learn economics, um, what would be your take, and any other important subject which a designer should understand in parallel?
So one of the problems I have is this whole concept of a full stack designer. And I mean, I won't tell you anything. I actually started off almost being a full stack designer. So in fact, started off as a copywriter who moved into design, and started off like doing both art and copy when I was in advertising. So I was like a full stack ad guy. Then moved on to doing programming and doing design, programming, a little bit of copy, doing full stack work when I was, this is very early on in 2000. So there are times when you could be full stack, especially like in 2000, the web was really new. Technology was nascent. I was able to do a lot of JavaScript, a lot of ActionScript, a lot of HTML, CSS, and at the same time do a fair amount of design. And I could get away as a full stack designer. The truth is, I know object-oriented programming, but I don't know algorithms. I cannot be a great programmer, whatever said and done. So the whole thing about being full stack and being able to do all of this is sort of like saying that, okay, there is some or the other part of things that you are either weak in, or there are other people who are better than you. So the way I look at it is that it is good to be a generalist who understands what the various things are. So for example, when I was in advertising, I have done, like I said, copy, art, DTP work, production work, gone down to get artworks done and stuff like that. But at the same time, this was all from an idea that, okay, as a generalist, I knew what needed to be done. I knew what four color printing was, what CMYK thing, how the actual artwork would get prepared. The same thing happened when moving to the web, understanding how the technology stack worked, understanding what the communication part, the layer was. All of that is good, but at the same time, you need to say, I am sort of a specialist on one part of it, which is, let's say, if it is interaction design, I say, okay, interaction design is what I specialize in. User research is what I'm strong on. Visual design is what I can handle, but I would rather have somebody who is a very strong visual designer work with me. So from a point of view of full stack, I would say be a generalist. In case you are working with somebody who is better than you in some other point of view, and there is some amplification that you can do on your skills, that is great. I mean, but at the same time, just because you are full stack, don't be the only person on the team who's doing both the visual design, the interaction design, the user research, and the implementation and the programming, all of that yourself. It just is too much for one person.
Actually, it's sort of contradicts to my philosophy, but that's fine. It's great to understand the other perspective. But is it the same case across? Because if you're an early age startup, you can't really afford to have so many types of specialties. But if you go to Google or Facebook or like more specialized places where they can afford so many fragmentations, there's so many processes done. I'm sure like you know the scene with lot of startups, right? Pura mara mari chal raha hai.
Correct.
So in that case, you can't really bucket so many people, right?
Absolutely. So what I'm saying is that you be a generalist. So don't call yourself full stack, because full stack kind of implies that I am really good on visual design. I'm really good on interaction design. I'm really good on user research. I call myself a generalist. I can do a fair amount of user research. I can do passable visual design. Interaction design is something that I'm strong on. I understand a little bit of technology if need be. So there is a generalist nature to the work that I do. So if somebody comes into the team who is a very strong visual designer, I let them make all the calls on visual design. On the other hand, if somebody comes and says I'm a great user researcher, I make them let them do all the calls on user research. So when you are working in a startup, having that generalist model is more important than being full stack. So that is where I am coming from.
Yeah.
But the main question was in that thing also, if you want to study, would you want to study economics as a topic? I would not say economics, because I have a bit of a problem with economics, in the sense, this whole thing about homo economicus, which is kind of like the rational human being kind of a thing that says, everybody works towards profit, and that is the way.
Everything is based on incentives.
Correct, incentives. And then the whole thing is that incentives don't work. I mean, when we look at incentives, there are cases in which, for example, there was this study that Dan Ariely did in Madurai, where he paid incentives for people to do work. So he said that tried with incentives as low as 50 cents to all the way up to $50. And $50 in India is like huge money, and especially if you go to Madurai, it is like huge money. So what he did was, if you give them 50 cents, and the work that needs to be done is, let's say, a mundane job. If it's something as simple as saying, I need you to click this button, and this is what you need to keep on doing. If you increase the incentive from 50 cents to $1, the efficiency increased. If you increase it to $2, the efficiency doubled. So that thing happened. But the moment you started putting in a little more cognitive based work into it, let's say you say, okay, this is going to be based on you have to solve a puzzle, and for this puzzle, the faster you solve, I'm going to give you $10, versus somebody who is going to get 50 cents to somebody who's going to get $50. Now the person who's getting $50 performed the worst. So the more incentive that you give for a work that is cognitively oriented, the performance actually deteriorates. So economics is not able to easily explain some of these things, which is why I personally love the field of behavioral economics, which I feel is more in tune with how people behave. And if I were to recommend people to study anything, I would say behavioral economics. That I think is something that I absolutely say that people should be aware of. If that is not possible, then at least the whole idea of user psychology itself, I personally have this thing about, Western psychology still has a lot more to learn, but at least it is better to know your mind better than anything. And the reason I say Western psychology has a lot more to learn is because I've done this comparative psychology between uh, the Buddhist psychology and Western psychology. And seriously, the understanding of the mind that people had in India ages ago is like far superior than what the West has today. So, but even then, I would say psychology is much better a field for people, designers to study and add to their arsenal. Whether you think of yourself as full stack as a generalist or just as a designer.
Quite interesting. So this brings me to actually my last question. And the reason why I said economics is because, say, like a wave of designers coming in from different schools across the country, thinking about user first and thinking about user centered design and uh, like yeah, these budding designers, frankly, I teach some places sometimes, so they are either clueless about what's happening in the actual industry, while the curriculum is designed with certain assumptions which are sort of outdated in certain context. So the question is, like, what are you bringing in as a designer into the system? Is it somewhere leading to growth? Is it somewhere leading to a business impact? Is it somewhere leading to a value which the user is getting? So all that put together, like, what has been your experience while dealing with these budding designers, and what would be your sort of take on where to bend the rules, where to go with the flow, where not to reinvent the wheel, and yet provide value, and understand the larger scheme of things, right? You can't be adamant about certain design principles which you have learned in design school, but they are nowhere in relatable even to money or business,
Right.
right? So if you have any, I mean, that's
Right.
my concluding question to
Yeah. So I think it's a good question to end off with. One of the things I see today is that whenever I get uh, portfolios of younger designers, I see a format. There's a case study. It starts off with some basic idea of what it's going to be. There's going to be a user persona. There's going to be a journey map. There's going to be some high level wireframes that they say I have done it on paper, taken for screenshots or camera shots of that. It kind of reads as though somebody has been copying templates after templates after templates after templates. There is like it is a process that people have been following. And I remember this whole talk by Natasha Jain from Pentagram, where she talked about design thinking is bullshit. And while I think that she was being provocative in some sense, but there is a whole thing about ठीक है समझ गया, you are using a process, but what is your input on that? So I think that is where we kind of say that people should be taught the process, but they should also be made to understand that it is not the output of the process that is important, but the outcome that is important. What usually happens is my output of the process is one persona. My output of this part of the process is one journey map. The output of this part is a wireframe. I mean, I don't care whether you come up with a journey map or you don't come up with a journey map. The outcome is, are you providing a better experience at the end of it, is what matters. And most of the time, in the when you look at the small things, you forget the big picture, and most of the time the designers forget the big picture. And I think it is time that designers snap out of this and start looking at the big picture and start solving for the big picture.
very, very nicely put, because just recently even I tweeted, I don't tweet a lot, but I tweeted saying that there are so many design schools and so many great dribble shots which are floating around, so many great Behance profiles, but why is, say, State Bank of India or government websites, or apart from probably food tech and couple of other domains here and there, everything is still not reached the
Yeah.
Sweden level. So
Yeah.
why is it so?
Yeah.
Is it all we have to blame as the other one, or like we as designers also have some responsibility of taking things up? So
Absolutely,
yeah,
absolutely. I think
yeah.
it is time that we designers, grow up and start looking at the big picture and solve for the things. And I don't want to say that India should become the next Sweden, But maybe India should have its own identity when it comes to design, and
Correct.
not necessarily Scandinavian design, but Indian design.
Yeah.
Like-
So true. So true. Cool. I think this is a good note. You want to add anything? Because it has been really, really a wonderful experience knowing your thoughts. And I would connect with you again for maybe the Buddhist philosophy angle, because even I'm inspired by that. I've done Vipassana a couple of times. So yeah. in fact, the Dhamma.org,
Right.
the website, it has an app also. Like me and one of my friends who was the head of design, head of product in Book My Show. We have designed the Vipassana app, the main.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah, it's not that great because it's scattered all over the world. A lot of
Right.
developers from Korea and other places have developed it. But yeah, the main library was given by me. So I'm curious to understand that aspect of your life.
Absolutely. That's a topic that is very close to my heart. So anytime I'd love to talk on that.
Superb. Cool. We'll conclude this. Thanks a lot once again.
Thank you, Kedar. Thank you.
And that's it from today's Gyan session. Catch us on iTunes, Saavn, Stitcher, or any podcasting app you use. Do rate us on iTunes and follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Stay tuned for more Gyan on audiogyan.com. Till then, bye.